It was January 30th, 2014. Two local men, Emil Libocmento and Russell Lakidric, stared at the twisted body laid out on the shore. They'd rushed across the lagoon in the Marshall Islands deep in the heart of the Pacific Ocean when they noticed the drifting remains of a fishing boat off in the distance. But what nobody expected was that the body that had just washed up on the shore could still be alive. He was undressed, clutching a knife and screaming in Spanish. It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived on their own out there, and judging by his appearance, he'd been on the water for quite some time. His hair was matted, his beard curling outward, unkempt like some kind of lagoon-dwelling wild man. His ankles had swollen up, leaving him barely able to walk, while his wrists were tiny and weakened. He hid his face from Russell and Emmy, refusing to look either of them in the eye. His name was Jose Salvador Alvarenga. He'd been adrift for 438 days, floating 6,700 miles across the Pacific Ocean. He wasn't supposed to survive, and when he'd first set out, he hadn't been alone. By the age of 37, Jose Salvador Alvarenga had been fishing for sharks in Mexico for decades. The fisherman, originally from El Salvador, was something of an expert. He would take out a small skiff, normally accompanied by a friend, a fellow fisherman, and travel into the Pacific Ocean. A few days would pass, 2-3 at the most, and Alvarenga would return with his crewmate, hauling several sharks after a successful catch. His employer would buy Alvarenga's haul for 50 cents to a pound, hardly a lot of money for all those days spent waiting for the sharks to swim close enough to the skiff, but Alvarenga would make enough to get by. But one Saturday, November 17th, back in 2012, he would take a trip that would irreversibly change the course of his life. When Alvarenga was around 36 or 37 years old, he was due to take yet another trip out to sea. He planned to take a long, grueling 30-hour shift on the water, something that only an experienced sailor and fisherman like him would be equipped for. Even then, Alvarenga would still be spending a long time deep-sea fishing in the hopes of returning with an assortment of sharks, marlins, and sailfish. Everything was prepared as it usually was. The skiff was ready to set out, but there was a problem. Alvarenga's usual crewmate, a close friend with whom he'd been on many prior fishing trips, someone almost as experienced as he, didn't show up. Going out on the water alone after such a long time was far too risky, but with everything arranged and a need to return having caught something, Alvarenga was backed uncomfortably into a corner. His employer wouldn't be too pleased if the trip was canceled on such short notice, so Alvarenga needed a second. But with no sign of his regular fishing partner, he was forced to think on his feet. Over on the nearby beach, he spotted something that seemed to present him with an answer to his problem. There was a group of men working down on the beach, any one of them able enough, it seemed, to help Alvarenga. Even if they hadn't done all that much sailing, he felt that he certainly possessed the decades' worth of expertise to compensate. So, Alvarenga approached the workers down on the beach and struck up a conversation with them. He explained his situation and that he needed someone to help him for a long shift of deep-sea fishing. It'd be hard work lasting well over a day, but eventually one of the workers came forward. His name was Ezequiel Cordoba, a man that Jose Salvador Alvarenga had never met nor spoken to before in his life. He didn't even ask the younger man his surname before the two readied the boat to set sail. Neither of them could have predicted what would happen next. Much as Alvarenga had expected, his newly recruited shipmate was a rookie when it came to seafaring. Not that Alvarenga had foresaw this causing an issue. Boarding the skiff and heading out, the two departed from Costa Azul, a fishing village near Pijijiapan, just off the coast of Chiapas, Mexico. Their craft was a 23-foot fiberglass skiff, roughly around the size of an SUV, with no top and running on a single outboard motor. There was an icebox on board the size of a refrigerator for storing their catches. Ready for the long, almost 2-day trip they were facing, Alvarenga and Cordoba began sailing the skiff along a pre-planned course out onto the Pacific Ocean. However, it doesn't take long for things to start going wrong. At first, the two men are working well together and catching a lot too. Before long, they had amassed the better part of almost 1,000 pounds of fresh fish and thrown it in the icebox. And that was when they noticed the storm approaching. From a distance, it didn't look so bad to Alvarenga, maybe some impending choppy waters and nasty wind speeds, but nothing too severe, especially with all of his experience. It was a gamble, but with Cordoba's help, he was catching plenty of fish, so he decided to stay put for the time and keep reeling in the abundant sharks that swam in the waters. They kept the skiff in the water until the storm rolled in, and it started to look less and less like they were going to keep afloat. So Alvarenga made the call. It was time to head back to shore. But as they turned in the direction they came from, the storm was whipping the sea into a frenzy, jostling the skiff this way and that, until, unbeknownst to both Alvarenga and Cordoba, they were driven off course. Soon enough, the waves started getting bigger, so much so that the water started to come crashing into the boat. It seeped into the inner workings of the skiff, flooding the engine. Then the engine died. Carried by the furious tides, the boat started to drift. Aboard a tiny vessel with no sails, no oars, no anchor, Alvarenga and his rookie shipmate were lost in the open ocean. Within hours of losing the skiff's single outboard motor, the huge, relentless storm hammered down on them from above. It caused massive swells in the water, causing the boat to lurch violently up and down, enough to make even a seasoned seaman sick to his stomach. What's worse, even though the motor had died, it was still affixed to the back of the skiff, dead weight, and heavy at that, which started to throw off the weight distribution across the entire boat. It started spinning around uncontrollably, hurling much of Alvarenga's fishing nets and other equipment overboard. The few portable electronics aboard the skiff were thrown into the water or damaged beyond use. But thinking quickly, Alvarenga grabbed the two-way radio and made a distress call to his employer. He had seconds to get through to someone back on the shore, alerting them that he and Cordoba desperately needed help right before the radio's battery died, rendering it useless. Struggling to regain control of the spinning skiff, Alvarenga realized there was another large weight aboard, causing uneven distribution across the boat, all the fish they had caught. Even though he and Cordoba had successfully caught around 1,100 pounds of fish, right now they were in a crisis. They could always catch more fish on a clearer day, but not if they went overboard and died out here in the storm. Making the tough call, Alvarenga and Cordoba were forced to dump everything they caught overboard, in the hopes that it would make the skiff easier to maneuver in the unforgiving weather. As they threw the fish overboard, the powerful waves carried them all away, along with their nets and the majority of their tools. What few electronics had been aboard the skiff were now destroyed, leaving the two men no way to contact the shore or to further signal for help. Alvarenga had succeeded in contacting his boss, but without a way to pinpoint the boat's location, it would be hard enough to find them, even if it wasn't for the storm and the waves carrying them off course. Both of them frantically using their hands to scoop water out of the boat or bailing out the skiff. All the while, Alvarenga and Cordoba were screaming at each other, spending hours and hours battling against the water, getting aboard the boat, and threatening to sink it. The storm lasted for 5 whole days, nearly an entire week. When the storm ended and the sea went calm, Alvarenga took a look at their surroundings for the first time since departing Costa Azul. To his astonishment, there was nothing around but a wide open ocean. No land in sight, nothing to give him any indication of where they were, how far away the shoreline was, hell, even what direction they need to head to reach dry land if they could move at all. There were only 2 safety features aboard the skiff, one of them being a Ziploc bag containing a cell phone, but thanks to the waves carrying them further from the shore, the boat was nowhere near close enough to land for cell coverage to reach them. The only other option was a barrel to use for flotation if the boat sank. Just grab onto the barrel and hold on for dear life, either until a rescue boat finds you or until you can't hold on any longer. That was it, the full and bleak extent of Alvarenga and Cordoba's very limited options, and as if those weren't bad enough, the way the skiff was painted made it much harder to spot if anyone came looking for them. The inside of the boat was blue, with the outside painted white. It was almost perfectly camouflaged against the ocean, meaning the rescue looked like it would be even less likely to happen, if at all. Since the fishing gear aboard had been lost or damaged in the storm, the 2 men were left with only basic supplies and very little in the way of food to keep themselves alive. Beyond just the clothes on their backs, Alvarenga and Cordoba were left with a handful of matches, a small mirror the size of a baseball, and a stick. Thinking they spotted a cargo ship in the distance, the 2 men attempted to catch the attention of the crew on board, hurriedly tying one of their shirts to the end of the stick and lighting it on fire. Alvarenga waved it around in the air, trying to flag down the larger boat in hopes that anyone would spot the flames at a distance and divert the cargo ship toward him and Cordoba, bringing them aboard and back to the safety of dry land. After a few moments, it became painfully apparent that the ship's crew had not noticed Alvarenga and Cordoba, and keeping the shirt burning risked setting the whole skiff ablaze. So, putting the fire out, the 2 men changed tactics, grabbing the small mirror that they had in hand. Trying to angle it just right so that they could catch what little sunlight there was, they made several agonizingly futile attempts to use the reflection to signal the cargo ship. What few glints of refracted light they managed to make are either missed or ignored completely. Before long, the cargo ship in the distance had already slowly drifted out of view, leaving the 2 men stranded and alone once more. Meanwhile, closer to the shore, Alvarenga's employer was attempting to track down the missing fishing boat. Having received the radio message from the adrift skiff, he gathered a search party. However, thanks to the storm rolling its way toward the shore, visibility at sea was poor, and after just 2 days, the search had to be called off entirely, leaving Alvarenga and Cordoba on their own. Days at sea turned to weeks, some of them passing without rain, leaving both men on the verge of death, thanks to intense dehydration. The thirst was unbearable. Alvarenga could feel his tongue had swollen up inside his mouth, so much so he could hardly even speak. Had it not been for the eventual arrival of rainwater, both stranded sailors would have undoubtedly suffered a slow, painful death. Soon enough, they began to drift across discarded water bottles floating in the ocean, and even an empty 55-gallon oil drum. Acting quickly, Alvarenga and Cordoba started to grab as much of the floating plastic waste out of the ocean as they could. Sadly,